do anything with you.
Okay, I will introduce today simply because even though I'm presenting and you guys have seen some of this before, we have a new person joining us, Cameron Catatani from the Social Psychology program and our Evolutionary Social Cognition Lab, has added some elements to this project. And then Sophia has also bolstered a lot of what I've talked about in the past. And so I will endeavor not to do too much talking, but I do have to do the intro and then let them talk for a little bit. And then we really do want to try to get to experimental methods and designs that we're interested in doing. Um, so I will share the screen and get started with this. And I also have to point out that I have to run the I have to run the PowerPoint for them. And so I'll try to do a good job of that, but I've not really haven't
Okay,
worked
so
the
we
bugs
we
out of
see
that.
the presenter mode now.
There,
Oh
can you
no,
see
okay.
it?
No, now it's good.
Okay, now it's set. Yeah.
Okay. And uh one of the things I wanted to start off with, uh we've changed the names of this several times. Uh, Technologies of Transcendence is a term that I was using a while back simply because I really like the notion of thinking about these. They're really probably more formally methodologies of enhancing group cohesion and raising consciousness or inducing trances, which might not be raising. Maybe that's lowering conscious. I don't know. It depends on what you think about the directions. Um, But the project is really about how these collective embodiment practices might lead to health and self-actualization outcomes. And we might talk a little bit about brainwave entrainment, but I don't have any illusions about getting that far in the talk. This is me, Sophia, Cameron, but I also have to make it very clear that although they will be involved in the project, Lindsay, Latasha, and Jake are not at all responsible for the content of this, and they can leave at any time. Um, and so, and every mistake in here is probably going to be mine. Uh, for each of the four sections that we are going to try to cover today, because we are talking about a lot of practices that are coextensive with the hippie lifestyle. I will be providing a tie-dyed transition slide. And I want to point out and give props to Cameron. She is like the most talented tie-dye artist I have ever seen. And so maybe since this is the science of art, music, and brain activity, we should have some kind of group gathering and she can teach us how to do this at some point. I don't mean to throw that at you, Cameron, but I
Oh,
know that.
just fine.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you very much.
All right. So the overview, we are in the process of seeing a lot of secular rituals and practices uh, spontaneously emerge in society that promote spirituality and or higher consciousness. Now, I say that they're spontaneously emerging, but they're often not being invented ex nihilo. They are often appropriated, which is sometimes a negative term, but I think it's somewhat positive here, from traditional cultures. So I like thinking about it as a kind of regenerative sustainability of these ancient practices. Um, these all often have a musical component, and that can be either performative, like happens when we're drumming or we're chanting, or it's just background music that's part of the ritual setting. So we're going to talk about embodiment practices. But throughout, if you want to ask questions or at least keep in mind the fact that music could be critical to this. In my personal opinion, the yoga classes that I find the most um, powerful, the ones that I go back to, are the ones that have particularly good music. And if I'm in a yoga class and I hear Walking on Sunshine by Katrina and the Waves come on, I'm out of there. Not going to go back. So why are we seeing these things happen? Uh, I think there is an innate need for experiences that take us out of ourselves, that induce a kind of ego loss because it allows a recalibration of our of all of the it turns off all of those scripts that we've constantly got running in our default mode network, allows us to step out of ourselves and recalibrate and find what's more important, what's more balanced in living. And I think that traditional peoples often found these practices. There's a convergence across cultures where you see these things happening. There are many cultures where there's not even a distinguishing between dance and singing and music. These are all seen as the same kind of thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at how uh, some elements might drive brain entrainment. I say music here, but I think that we're probably going to be mostly focusing on specific embodiment movement exercises that involve either doing something yourself or doing something that has to be coordinated with other people. Um, so we're interested in how these micro levels interact with the practices as a whole. And we're particularly interested in what the tangible outcomes of these practices are. Practices lead to positive health outcomes, well-being. I will use the term resilience to diseases of despair because it's a piece of language that someone asked for at a funding agency at one point. And despite the fact that they didn't fund me, I thought it was a nice way of talking about things. Um, and then the other aspect is self-actualization. Um, we increasingly see as people are not having to work industrial factory jobs 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, that they're engaging in leisure time activities. Well, I mean, the bulk of them are probably going home and drinking beer and watching Netflix, but more and more people are engaging in these uh, practices. And it would be of real interest to figure out which practices work well with which types of people. Um, I'm also interested in whether the practices would help or hurt the existing social order, but I'm more interested in that in terms of why there might be resistances to the widespread adoption of certain practices. Because we certainly saw that in the case of some other entheogenic practices in the 1960s. So we're going to study this with ritualized practices and neuroscience, and that could be something really fancy like EEG, but we're really just going to probably talk about a basic psychophysiological measure like heart rate variability. So the goal of this talk is to try to give you an overview and hopefully get to the point of strategies for studying this and funding it. Parts of the talk will have the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory referenced on them because we've got an internal funding request that we submitted to them. And so that's the research part that I want to talk about most, the programmatic aspect of it. But um, there's also a really cool new division at NIH. They don't fund things themselves, but they uh, encourage funding. They facilitate other agencies incorporating alternative and complementary medicinal approaches. For a long time, they seem to be focused on nutrition and vitamins, but now there's a call for more and more practices like this. So there's this really interesting potential to get funded through NIH to do this work. And so that's what we're really looking to get to is an NIH submission. It's too ambitious to do it in February, so it would probably be the funding cycle in July, June or July, or the one that would be next October.
Hey,
So
Bob, question.
yeah.
I mean, I guess a couple, but one is like, can you give examples of diseases of despair? Is that more like,
Oh, alcoholism,
all right.
depression, anxiety. Those are the three that are the big ones. Yeah. So those are all lumped together by the people that use this term. And there's other ones too.
Are things.
So we're couching a lot of this in terms of this word entheogen. Lately, I'm really fond of having talks that have words that I have to define and then define again when people show up late. Um, Entheogen is a term that is being used to replace psychedelics and psychedelic assisted therapy. It's a term that means discovering the God within. Those of you that are up on your ancient Greek, that was obvious to you, but I think it's nice to, sort of spell that out. Um, and it's been used a lot to talk about psychoactive substances or hallucinogens. Um, and it's especially used in the realms where people are using these in religious, spiritual, or ritualistic contexts. It is a neologism, um, and it's employed to refer to culturally sanctioned visionary experiences in ritual or religious contexts. Uh, but I don't think it necessarily just has to designate psychoactive substances. Why can't a practice be entheogenic? In fact, yoga is explicitly entheogenic. The very nature of the term, the way that some people interpret it, uh, means a yoking or a union. Sometimes you think yoga is thought of as yoking the body to uh, reach some transcendent state. Sometimes it's said that the etymology is really um, about yoking yourself to the divine, recognizing the divine within. And so the term entheogen, I think, really needs to be referring not just to exogenous substances, but to endogenous capacities of the human being to reach these states. And it actually turns out that, if you fast for 4 days and go climb a mountain, you will have your pituitary will release dimethyltryptamine, which is one of the most powerful psychedelics that we know. So we endogenously make this stuff. Um, and and so that's why I think this has an appropriate it's appropriate to use it in this context. We can look beyond yoga though. There are practices from Kabbalah, Sufism, Tibetan and Zen Buddhism, various places in Hinduism you find it, and almost all varieties of shamanism have elements that are entheogenic practices. Yes, shaman in Siberia might take the Amanita mushroom, but they also don't take it and they engage in drumming practices that are designed to induce a trance. Now we also see when I started off by saying we see a spontaneous reemergence of people gravitating to this. And one of the things I like to do as a bit of a segue here is talk about how Joseph Campbell, uh, one of the most important scholars of religious studies, uh, after years of studying the religions of the world and really being interested in mystical experiences, started he was invited to a Grateful Dead show, and he said, "This is like the Eleusinian mystery cults." A quote, "When you see 8,000 kids all going up in the air together, this is powerful stuff." He reminded us of the Dionysian festivals, and took it as proof of his theory that ancient myths and rituals are still echoed today. I would say not just echoed, but being rediscovered and really embraced. "This is more than music," he told an audience after seeing the dead. "It turns something on in here," indicating his heart, "and what it turns on is the life energy. This is Dionysus talking through these kids." Was there a question? Okay. "It doesn't matter what the name of the god is, whether it's a rock group or a clergy," he concluded, "it's somehow hitting that chord of realization of the unity of God in all of you." Now, I would go so far as to say that the key thing here is not just the music, but it is being in community, dancing with a bunch of other people. I was listening to a podcast by Ram Dass, or that has Ram Dass lectures in it, the other day, and he was talking about the club scene in Britain, the techno club scene in the 1980s, and how it started off being something where young people were doing MDMA and going and dancing all night. But as the scene evolved, they less and less had to rely on this exogenous substance, because the coming together and the dancing and the way that the music evolved to respond to these dancers. There was a co-evolutionary process going on where the best DJs were the ones that were able to find music and respond to the way the dancers were behaving in a way that induced these entheogenic states without the need for exogenous substances. So EDM festivals are a current version of this Dionysian revelry, and they're much more than just some kind of party. That's a misunderstanding that a lot of people have about these experiences. So we're going to be interested in entheogenic practices, because the psychopharmacological entheogens might carry risks for some at the psychological level. Probably 1 to 3% of people really shouldn't do them at all, because it can be problematic if you've got any sort of issue where dopamine needs to be antagonized, or you start hallucinating naturally. So schizophrenia would be an example. There's debates about bipolar disorder. I think that it's probably not great for bipolar disorder too, but there's a lot of people with bipolar disorder who disagree with me and try to use these substances. And my experience is that it's not working great for them, but they're pretty adamant that it is. Um, so some people can't do it, but then other people can't do it because uh, there is, it's illegal. And even the government funded research on these entheogens generally is only approving research that involves going through lengthy therapeutic integrate preparation sessions beforehand, and then integration sessions afterwards, which is consistent with the way that a lot of more religious thinkers approach these substances. They say they open your perspective to what is possible, but you should not be um, relying on them. They give you a view of what's possible, and then you find practices to get there yourself. And it turns out that when you do look at the people that are engaged in psychedelic assisted therapy, uh, they're not just doing psychological integration sessions afterwards to talk through and integrate the insights that they've had. They often are then finding practices. And so in the yoga community, if you're involved in it, in the breathwork community, in the ecstatic dance community, you end up finding a lot of people that are completely straight edge sober. They experienced these things early on, they had problems with the substances, and now they've used these practices to engage, to get themselves to the same place. And so another pragmatic reason is that the government, it will fund entheogen research, but it's really hard to get that funding. And it's unlikely that they're ever going to support a broad rollout. You know, I've heard lots of people say, "Oh, the government should just give, everyone, every 6 months, access to some psychedelic experience." But that's never going to happen, or at least not in the near future. And certainly, if the election goes the wrong way, it's probably not going to happen for a really long time. Um, uh, so these other entheogenic practices, these methodologies, might be far more enticing if they can get you to the same place, even if it takes a little bit more work. So there's this great unexploited potential for these non-pharmacological variants to be used. And so we've got a number of projects that we want to look at, and they fall into three broad areas. First, I think the lowest hanging fruit is to do survey work on the health and well-being and self-actualization outcomes of these practices. And ideally, you'd want to benchmark it against the exogenous entheogens. So you could find cohorts of people that have experienced psychedelics and those that have not, but do these practices, and you'd maybe use. There's a couple of different ways to do this. One would be to take the people that have used the psychedelics and have used the practices and ask them to compare them. Anecdotally, that is done all the time in Reddit forums and things like that. So that seems to have some promise. But there's other strategies too, and we'll talk about those later. Um, I also really would like to grow the experimental evidence base for the health and well-being outcomes for these practices. Now, what I'm really interested in is self-actualization, but that is a luxury for a lot of people who are struggling to pay for their bacon at the store, if you believe certain political ads. And so, if you want to get funding for doing this research, then if you can show that it reduces the rate of alcoholism, the rate of suicide, anxious, depression, various things like that, that seems to be a promising strategy. And we need experiments to do that. Now, those experiments have some delicate nuances that we should be aware of, because you can't really do a double-blinded administration of a yoga or an ecstatic dance. People pretty much know that they're in the experimental group. Uh, so I'm interested in thoughts about how to approach this. Um, Finally, there's I would love to do neuroscience on these health and well-being outcomes, show that maybe they're related to some kind of uh, brainwave entrainment, look at how the musical elements augment this. That requires having an EEG lab. And I reached out to Sam McClure and discovered that Gene's lab has been packed up and retired. I don't know what the hell that's about. That's a real shame because those machines, I was using them and they still seem to be quite good. So we do have a bit of a problem, a hurdle that we have to get over with having the proper equipment. Mike, I know you've got some, but I think it's too antiquated to do what we need to do.
I wonder if
So,
like Marco or someone like that might Centella hook up.
uh, I know him, and I don't think he has the right equipment either, because we've talked about some of these things. Nor does Oro Koza, nor does Bob Atkinson. These are all the engineering folks that I know, and what they're interested in it's answering such different questions that it's not appropriate for what we're looking at. Okay, so now I want to move on to part two and let Cameron take over. This is about some meta-theoretical, evolutionary, and cross-cultural frames that we want to bring in that link the East and the West levels of being, consciousness, and wellness. The reason I want to dwell on this for a little bit is not just because I think it's relevant to the kinds of questions we want to ask people about what the outcomes are, but because there's this emerging project that we've got that's trying to dignify the uh, South Asian concept of the chakras. So I'll let Cameron take
Mhm.
over.
Yeah, actually, Vaughn, before we move on, I have a comment about something that you said. You were
Sure.
looking for maybe a control condition for aesthetic dances.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, you probably can't have, non-aesthetic dances because the moves would clearly be different in character. But I'm wondering if it would work if in your experimental condition you had the typical dance, but in your control condition, you scramble the order of the movements because presumably the order of the movements is a critical part of doing the dance. So if you take them kind of out of order,
Mm.
backwards or whatever, that might
Okay.
potentially interfere with the effects that should be produced by the dance.
That's a swell idea. When we get to that practice, come back. Let's come back to that.
Okay.
Because there is an order in which things are done, and I hadn't even thought about the fact that you could just invert that. You wouldn't invert it, but you'd be flipping the middle and the end points.
Right, exactly. You still have the same kind of movements as it were, but they wouldn't be in order, so you shouldn't get the same effect.
Yeah, that would also apply to, even though Sophia might talk about this, in Kundalini yoga, you often will have these very routinized movements. It's almost like eye movement, desensitization therapy,
Mhm.
uh, where I'm standing in a forward fold on my feet. My feet are on my hands, and I move my head back and forth, and I'm saying Nam something. I can't remember what it is. Uh, and and you do this, and it induces this really interesting state. And it's like they figured out that there's some combination of movements and sounds that induces this. But if you were to do it backwards, then it shouldn't work. If you were to take some of the chants that happen in puja ceremonies or dhuni ceremonies, uh, and you used the same syllables but in a different order, then it
Mhm.
shouldn't work. And if it does work, then you know that what you're dealing with vocal entrainment and not some kind of aspect of the specific vocalization.
Mhm.
Yeah, I love that. That is a
Because,
really good idea.
but also it would be interesting if it still worked because it might be that there's more variance in entrainment. You just need to have some entrainment, and if you also varied it so that it doesn't fit an entrainment well, like
Yeah.
the
Mike, that's my suspicion too. I do these chants in Sanskrit, and I'm usually spending the first 15 minutes going, why in the hell am I doing this? I don't even know Sanskrit. Uh, and then something happens and it becomes meaningful. But I have actually tried to do this with, okay, well, let's come up with one that actually means something in English. And I don't think it works as well. And
you
I
know
got
I,
a group of people to do
I
it.
would agree with that too. But I remember like transcendental meditation had this thing where they were giving each person their own mantra. And so, it's kind of like they had, I don't know, I think they came out that they had a list of like 30 of them or something they were using, but it seemed like there's a lot of variance. It wasn't, it had to be home kind of thing.
Mhm.
Um,
Right.
Yeah.
but there were some other commonalities as far as, so that's partly what I was thinking. And maybe certain vocalizations tend to work better than others because they have relaxing
Mhm.
musculature to them or something.
Yeah.
But there
The
does
idea
seem to be a lot of variance that you can. Go ahead, Tim.
I love that
I was
idea.
thinking the idea of scrambling though has some nice precedents in experimental psychology that you could draw on. If you look at, I think it was Biederman who did some of the work on scene recognition, and they showed normal scenes versus scrambled scenes.
Yeah.
It took people much longer to, detect an object in a scrambled scene than a normal scene.
Right.
So you can kind of
Holistic
draw
face
on that
perception
precedent.
too.
Exactly, exactly. You can
Yeah,
draw on that
holistic
as
face
a
perception. That's
precedent.
great. Yeah, wonderful. Because this was one of the things I was really stuck on. And I thought I came up with a nice solution last weekend, the weekend before last, when I was hastily trying to get this stuff out for the funding call. Okay,
There's
but
another
go ahead.
possibility, which is it's not exactly a good control condition. I think some of these are better, but you also may want to add a covariate like the sheep-goat scale that Mike talks about a little bit. Like, is
Yeah.
somebody willing to believe in this, or are they very resistant? And
Yeah.
either as a covariate or break them into two groups and look at like, well, does it work for people that are goats versus sheep?
And there's an existing scale.
Yeah, it's been
Oh, I
around for
love it.
50 years.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I think it comes out of some of Ryan's parapsych work. That's where they discovered this because the people that believed in, psi were more likely to give them significant results than the people that didn't believe in it.
Oh,
Exactly.
I've already filled up an entire sticky note, which is a really dumb way to take notes, I know.
It's a
Okay.
sticky way to take notes.
Okay. It's a good time. Like these little different part slides will be good for us to have questions and talking like this so that we can look at Cameron's lovely tie dyes. Uh, I find it very soothing and it helped my thinking. There's another thing we could do.
I was surprised to see that there.
Yeah.
Those
I
in
know I
after I
probably
saw the
should have
draft.
asked I probably should have asked your permission.
Oh, it's a public account. Permission is
Yeah,
all. So,
that's
but
right.
it's very nice. Thank you very much. It's also nice to put faces to names. So, hi. He introduced me already, Cameron Katatani, in the social area, but this is a kind of branching off of one paper that I was looking at, written by Doug Kenrick from our social area. But I think that a lot of us are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy. It was from 1943, and it pretty much shows five multiple yet independent structures within this pyramid. They are hierarchical, and it starts at immediate physiological needs: food, water, shelter. Then you go to safety, followed by love, affection, belonging. Once all of those are satisfied in order, then you can move on to esteem and respect. And then Maslow put at the top of this pyramid self-actualization. And they are meant to be independent and hierarchical. He was saying you cannot access safety until you satisfy your immediate physiological needs. You cannot access love, affection, and belonging until you satisfy safety needs, and so on. Meaning that at the very top, self actualization comes after you unlock all of the rest. But if you move to the next slide, our faculty here have kind of adapted this to match these Western fundamental motives. So, from the evolutionary perspective, it's a bit of a funky perspective, but the ultimate goal is to reproduce, to have genetic offspring, and that our behaviors are guided by the gene wanting to live on. So, we're going to behave in ways that allow for our reproductive success. They actually took away self actualization from the top of that pyramid because they didn't see it as a functionally distinct human need. Some papers have found that self-actualization, or the concept of that, within college students was associated to status seeking, and that's around the middle of the pyramid. So in 2010, they kind of adapted Maslow's hierarchy to maintain basic ones like immediate physiological needs, again, food, water, shelter. Then self-protection. They kind of operationalize this as disease avoidance and any other self-protection. I think it's like belief in a dangerous world. Then they move on to affiliation, feeling of belongingness. Followed by that, then you kind of get into this social hierarchy because we are social animals. There's this pecking order, so to speak. Once you know that you are affiliated and belong to a group, then you can move into gaining status and esteem within the group. Following that, it is implied within the evolutionary framework that you can acquire your mate once you have a certain level of status, and or you achieve status in order to acquire and attract your mate. So then followed by that is mate retention. We know that offspring are more successful and child rearing is more successful when you're able to retain a mate because humans have a lot of investment in their offspring. And then at the very top, they put parenting, which is rather this kind of follows Erik Erikson's generativity, kind of how you pass on wisdom, child rear, and care for your kin. So they kind of shifted how the little triangles are lined up in the pyramid They aren't independent and hierarchical, so to speak, but they're rather nested and overlapping. So mate acquisition or mate retention, let's say you're on a date, but then something dangerous happens, you can shift between your motives based off of the salience, the proximate inputs, any other stimuli that's happening at the time. So these goals are typically overlapping, but this is a very Western way of looking at things. It definitely does not include self-actualization. And I think that that's actually a very important aspect of the human psyche that is kind of just brushed under the rug. So let's see what the next slide says. So they did find individual differences. So the faculty found, you can keep tapping through the slides, that there are individual differences in how fundamental motives relate meaningfully to other individual differences. This could include the big five, but the image here shows the strongest correlations from one of the studies. This was done, I think, in 2016. Yes. So all of these right there that you see listed in that table go to each of those 7 fundamental motives. And you can either keep tapping through, or that might be it for this slide. It's always hard when you're not the one in control of the tapping. But moving to the, oh no, yeah, you're good. You can move forward one more.
All right.
No, it's perfect. So the 7 chakras, I know it's a tiny bit of a segue, but they also kind of follow this overlapping yet hierarchical structure, but it is not talked about in Western psychology or Western postmodern world. This is something typically very East Asian, and I know it's not necessarily Native American, but it's very spiritual and follows that overlapping hierarchical structure. And it shows starting at the red, orange, I mean, it follows a nice rainbow, but it starts at the base of the spine and goes up to the crown of the head. You can tap through, I think, twice more. It represents the mind-body connection. So in the middle image, you can see that there are different bodily functions or physiology that is associated with it. So the root at the base of the spine can deal with reproductive organs, kidneys. The sacral will deal with bladder, reproductive organs, and so on. And I'll get into what each of those mean. And I don't know how familiar you are with it. It certainly seems woo-woo, which is kind of the stigma we want to break, because this has been a strong tradition in certain cultures for so many years that we don't address. And we're trying to conceptualize our psychology and our motives in a completely different way. And it can range from individual to collective spiritual needs. So how I as a person need to be safe. And that's at that root, that base, that immediate physiological need. Am I safe? Do I have food and water? And then it can go all the way to the top, the crown, or transcendence, self-actualization. Am I experiencing harmony? Am I transcending? Is there peace? So this could blend both the individual and collective fundamental motives.
Next.
Oh, yes. So what are the chakras? You can tap through all of them. I have a little animation, but starting at the bottom is the root, and that could deal with the immediate physiological needs. Safety, feelings of fear and survival. Sacral deals with desire, emotions, creativity, creation, pleasure. This is kind of where the reproductive organs are. So if you want to look at creativity in that aspect. Solar plexus is more of the core. So that deals with esteem, status, purpose, confidence, or will. The heart focuses on belonging, connection, love, and hope. You can tap through to the next ones. The throat might work with expression, openness, communication, speech, how we express ourselves. And then the third eye, located right here, deals with understanding, perception, intuition, and insight. And then last, we have the crown. And this could be where Maslow was talking about self-actualization, peace, universal connection, transcendence. Oh, I actually have the book over on my shelf right now. I see in the chat. Haven't exactly read beyond a couple pages, but yes, that's my winter break reading to-do list. But essentially, yes, let me make sure I get the title right. Yes, Eastern body, Western mind. We're trying to conceptualize our psychology in this very Western way when Eastern cultures have this kind of embodiment. All right, next slide.
Who suggested that? I'm not watching the because I'm
Yeah.
Oh,
recording.
no, you're good, Timothy.
It was me.
Oh, great. Yeah, we could start a book club over the fall break if you want, or winter break, because we're quite interested in it.
So I don't know if the colors look a little funky on your guys' end, but when I made it, it was like really vibrant rainbow. And then so it's essentially just the rainbow, but on the left you can see the characters of the chakras, so to speak. And I know it looks out of order, but I go from bottom to top because it's typically how the chakras are organized. You can see the social motives maybe from a more social psychology perspective, and then we can get into emotions or psychological mechanisms by which those emotions or motives are carried out. And then on the right, we have neuro or physio mechanisms. And that's not my ballpark. So anything in here, we can take it out, we can move things around, we can put it in, but essentially you can see at the bottom, for instance, the root or security, the immediate physiological needs can deal with fear, anxiety, or if those are satisfied, maybe serenity. And a neurophysio mechanism could be the amygdala activation, adrenaline, the limbic system, hypothalamus. And as you go up, maybe at the heart chakra, you can see that social motives could be mate retention or kin care, how you feel nurturant love, hope, affection towards people. And the neurophysio mechanism could be oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, endorphins. As we move our way to the top, we see the crown chakra, transcendence, or maybe self actualization. Emotions could be acceptance, peace, or wisdom. Mechanisms by which we get there could be altruism or meditation. And then the neurophysio mechanism could be the pineal gland. So there are so many different moving bits and pieces that I think could fit here, but I don't know how many other sites we put in here of this, but essentially that revised hierarchy is missing something. It's missing the transcendence. It's missing the self-actualization, which continue to be a big drive for people, whether or not you come from America and have this different Western culture. This drive to find a deeper meaning in the human experience definitely underlies a lot of our psychologies. And it doesn't just stop at finding a mate or having a child and parenting that child. And although that might be a very strong motive for many people, it does not address how individuals operate as themselves and want to find deeper meaning alongside everyone else in the world. That sense of oneness that people get when they do have those godlike and theogenic experiences. So, yeah, I don't, you can go to the next slide. I don't know how many there are here.
Before you do, I just want to say this is a great slide, and you have already pointed out something like mate acquisition is much lower than in their pyramid. Their pyramid is this very like linear. It's like those old cognitive models that were uh, flow charts, like Sternberg's additive factors kind of thing. And and you're already seeing here where it kind of breaks down. Uh, certainly we know plenty of people that don't have to achieve status before they acquire mates.
Yes.
And parenting motives often happen without having any sort of other things satisfied. They're thrust
Mhm.
upon people, no pun intended. Uh, and then, like the other thing I wanted to say is that maybe self-actualization really starts kicking. Maybe all those fundamental motives are in the three lower chakras, and self-actualization really starts at the heart and above, and there's just different kinds. You'll see in Maslow's work when he talks about it, he talks about these being needs, uh, and these various things that qualify as self-actualization. So it has a lot of texture, but I think this is a really swell slide. I like it a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to comment. I like this slide a lot too. Just
Oh,
I'll
thanks.
go back.
yeah, go back for a
I'm trying
second.
to go back.
Yeah. I mean, I know the chakras have been around a long time, so I was just curious about the history. Like, is this a slight adaptation of a version that was written like 500 years ago, or like what's the kind of, and also there certainly must be a bunch of disagreement about people exactly which chakras are doing exactly what. Like, what's the source for
So,
this?
Sophia, can you field that question?
Basically, where are these coming from in the history of them is what.
Yeah.
It's been a while since I've studied the chakras. We talked about it in my yoga teacher training a couple years ago. Um, so I'm not sure how great of an answer I can give. But eh,
That's all right. I mean, I was just curious.
it's tied to energy flow, sort of, and energy sources in the body. And I mean, Cameron talks a lot about the different purposes of the different chakras, how they do sort of move up, but basically different physical poses in yoga, without getting too much into yoga, will call on certain chakras to try to move the energy in those areas. And so sort of like energy sources, so to speak, in the body that are tied to different things. So it goes back to Indian philosophy at the
Well,
beginning.
so that, I don't want to pin you down and say like, just if you know the answer is fine.
That's the
Fine.
best that I can do off the top of my head. It's
But
been a
no, I'm
while
just
since I've
thinking
studied
like as far as my understanding is, it's associated with like Hinduism. That could be,
Oh, yeah.
500 years old. It could be 1,000. It could be a couple of thousand. And
I haven't done my own history search on exactly like how old they are. I just know like they've got to be over hundreds of years old, I would assume,
I
just
think
based
it's
off of how it is.
actually, I think it's more than that. I think they go back to
Yeah.
Ayurvedic medicine, which goes back to the Vedas, which
Right.
would be a couple
It's
thousand years
3,000
old at
years
least.
old.
Okay.
But
well,
it is important to note that there are different variations of them.
yeah,
Not
that's
everybody
that was part of
uses
my question.
seven. Some people, I mean, these are the basic chakras, but there are other ones uh, in different traditions. And also you have things that are really similar in the Pueblo cultures out here. Anyone in the Uto-Aztecan language group, like the Hopi, they have a similar model. And so there's other cultures that have come up with this too. But I think that I mean, we can see it not as we can see it as something that is not just a model of some physical system, because it's hard to find what the physical evidence of it is. It corresponds to these things, but also as a kind of level of psychological awareness too. And I think that even in the old writings, they may imply that it's a psychological model.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. First of all, for Cameron and Sophia, like this is an incredibly friendly audience. Like we're a lot of us know some of this stuff, and we're definitely, I think, in agreement with your insights, or at least a lot of us are, that it's a worthy way of thinking about things. I mean, part my questions are more just, if somebody was presenting like the Bible or something, you'd go like, okay, there's some wisdom there, but there's certainly not just one version of it.
Yeah.
So when you put this up here, I mean, it looks like it's kind of, is it one that, maybe you sort of put together that really fits a lot of, it looks really good actually to me too, as far as matching Maslow and Kenrick and stuff like that. It has those things in there, but it's not like this is the way everybody thinks of the chakras.
No, this is like total patchwork, just
Yeah,
throwing
all
things
right.
in there. This is a melting pot of motives, mechanisms, emotions. And to kind of use one of the words that we mentioned earlier that we joked about is I'm kind of appropriating, so to speak, the most popular 7 chakras that
Yeah,
us
all
in the
right.
Western world might kind of understand chakras to be. So when you look up chakras, these are the 7 that typically come up, especially within when you go to google.com, like our Western world. This is
Yeah,
what it spits out.
I guess I'm thinking along the what Vaughn was saying too. Like it's interesting and useful as a model, and it's like and it looks like as good a model and maybe better than Kenrex as far as I'm concerned. But it's well, I agree with you on the things like it seemed like it's sort of arbitrary to say parenting's the top thing, and to me, it always felt a little bit like um, that's the kind of thing someone that never feels awe might come up with. You
Yeah,
know,
that's a common that's a
Yeah.
common
well, I don't
statement.
know, like but I also, I have to assume that parenting is the ultimate goal of evolution, to me, I think is even limiting too, because evolution's sort of interesting that it keeps building beyond a species.
Well,
Right.
it's also very Richard Dawkins-like. It's very selfish gene.
That's
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's like two books under the Eastern Body book over there on my shelf.
that's partly what I was thinking is that these higher levels of Maslow's pyramid, and this one fits in well with that, is in some ways it might be drawing us to a higher level of organization of a kind of evolutionary next step that we don't understand, because parts of things that move up to the next level of evolution, organizations don't ever understand things greater than themselves.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting that I feel like Doug actually does do self-actualization things and experiences awe. So really what he's trying to do is he's trying to think in terms in a different way. And the title of this was, renovating the pyramid. But I remember early on when we were working on this, I said, you're leveling the pyramid. And so in some sense, it's just really talking about the lower couple of levels and showing that there's not even a proper order to them. Sometimes, things occur out of order. But we probably shouldn't get too caught up on that. I did, before we move on, wanted to ask Lindsay, because she also is a yoga teacher. This is the most dominant model of the chakras, is it not?
I mean, like you all were saying, kind of throwing together all of the things, at least from what I know, because I've taken all sorts of different classes at different places where people have talked about this. Like this corresponds with what I
Yeah.
understand based on things like yoga teacher training and different classes, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. I would throw in that these are the seven major ones. Somebody else mentioned that they were the most common, but it's not the case that all chakras are created equal. These seven kind of major ones are the most important. There are various minor ones throughout the body, like in the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, and so forth.
Hmm.
So the chakra system goes beyond these seven. These are just the seven kind of most major ones.
Mhm. Yeah, I was just trying to pretty much align them to the motives to put that
Right.
Ev-Psych perspective into a more Eastern embodiment
Right.
practice. So I know that I mean I haven't really looked at like what they're called or different yoga poses that could activate them, but yeah, this was essentially finding the nice solid number of seven and just moving them equivalently.
Mhm. Which correlates very nicely with, the magic number seven plus or minus two, or the seven notes in the diatonic scale, or other instances of seven within cognitive processing.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, all right, so I'm looking at the time, so we should probably move on so that Sophia can get to her section too. Uh, so next slide. Another
Oh,
thing.
yeah, you can probably just keep tapping through. I think that we started talking about a lot of this in just passing conversation, but yeah, Ken Keyes has the model from 1973 saying that level 4 and above could act as resilience to diseases and deaths of despair. So that's that anxiety, depression, alcoholism. And then I think the next little tap slide is saying that the fundamental motives could be level 4 and below. If we want to include parenting and kin care, that would certainly deal with love. But maybe once you start shifting towards that self actualization motive, that love can be shifted from, oh, I love my kin, I love my family, to I love humanity and I love the world around me. So
Yeah.
maybe love is like that central, almost hourglass pivotal point at which we start seeing that change.
So it's the fourth chakra, right in the middle.
Yep. Hmm.
In Kundalini, they talk about the lower chakras being a pyramid with a big base at the bottom that goes up and then has the top point at the heart. And then the upper ones are an inverted pyramid that goes down and overlaps at the heart, which also becomes an important uh, yantra or symbol. If you slide those two triangles together, you end up getting a symbol of the union of polarities. So there's some really interesting things about this, not just from these perspectives, but in terms of the way that they think about uh, distinguishing between the upper and the lower ones. And Ken Keyes does the same thing. He really talks about the lower centers of consciousness, the higher centers of consciousness.
Mhm.
Shall I move on?
Yes. So yeah, we talked about the fundamental motives. Can click through. This is nothing new. It was on that little table there. And then individualism, collectivism, we could see this differently in Western or Eastern worlds or people with different motives. I think there are like three more: approach avoidance and agency, even. So, how much locus of control does someone perceive they have? And that can go into status and how they achieve their self-actualization. Do they believe that they are an active agent in their own life? Do they believe they have the God within them?
So these are all scales that we can use
Yes.
as assessments as we look at what the outcomes of these things are.
Yes, and I believe the next one, yeah, is the mystical experiences scale, and that could all get to you can tap through. There's internal and external unity, transcendence of time and space, ineffability, paradoxicality, sense of sacredness, and possibly one more, yeah, noetic quality. Those could get at the upper four and again, love isn't associated with that, but it gets at it in a different way. So this is just one of so many potential scales that we could use to get at those upper motives. And go ahead. Oh, deeply felt positive mood. Don't forget that. So I had a transition that like moved them all to the side, but essentially, can we shift this from a pyramid to concentric circles or something else? Maybe we do look at that pyramid with the inverted pyramid at the top. There are so many different ways that we can model that, but that's a little bit stylistic and beyond the point. But essentially, how can we take those fundamental motives and align them with the Eastern embodiment practices that have been around for now thousands of years?
I have a
So,
question on this too. Just like you don't have to rush through because this is really interesting. But like, why is this circle thing attractive to you? Is because they're
because I just moved the chakras, which were circles. That was it. It could still remain a pyramid. This was just easier to do in PowerPoint, quite honestly.
all right.
Open to input.
Well, no, I'm a Roger Shepard student, and he did a lot of geometric modeling, and I think it's you guys are doing a good job of reminding us these are all just models, and that we're trying to simplify some really complicated system that are getting the more the basic structure of the things that we think are important captured in there. So sometimes the geometry that you use, like, does have some advantages for communicating some
Well,
aspects.
if I like that perspective for sure, and if you want some sort of answer right now, I mean, the triangled pyramid is very structured. It has a strong base, and this is more organic. And I think that it kind of incorporates maybe the more Eastern side of things that aren't looking at it in such a stringent, strict Western way.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah,
And also,
and chakra is the Hindu word for wheel or circle. So
Oh,
oh, really?
did
yeah,
not know that. Well,
yes.
that's actually, I did this on purpose. Circles are here on purpose.
But yes,
Maybe
it
it's
does
your
fit. I did a paper, I don't know, it was like 20 years ago, looking at the kind of icons that websites use for different things like, airlines and stuff like that. And then they tested it out, the student in Asia and the US, to show that there's the cultural preferences. And the Asian ones they tended to be more smooth and less, I don't know, dramatic or something. I don't know what the word exactly. So there might be something about pointy triangles versus smooth circles that's
Wasn't there that like
aesthetically.
Kiki and Boba study?
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
I really like that one. So, yeah, I mean, this one just feels a little more organic, welcoming compared to the hierarchical pyramid. So,
yeah, that's so kiki.
It makes it look like it's sort of more inside of rather than on top of.
mhm.
So I don't know. So there might be some, if you're thinking in terms of it's there all along, it's just needs to sprout or something like that, versus it doesn't exist and you need to grow it on top of or whatever.
Mhm.
It's almost like Russian dolls, the way they're embedded in each other.
Yeah, it does feel a little enveloping and a lot more warm compared to the triangle hierarchy that I know so very well. But I do enjoy this one. Though quite as much as I do love the feedback, yeah, it was just kind of just a stylistic element that I chose to put in for the PowerPoint. There might be one more slide about applications. I'm not sure if that was put in. Oh, whoopsie. No.
Oh goodness, I hope I didn't
Oh,
inadvertently put
see,
everything
these are
in
all of my
twice.
transitions.
Ah, yes, okay. Sorry. Just
That's
gonna move
okay.
through this really
But see, now
quickly.
it's a friendly reminder. How harsh does that pyramid really look?
I I
See,
just
there it is. There
ah
are the outcomes. But
okay.
essentially,
That's what you're looking for.
yeah, psychological and physical health, we can minimize those deaths of despair, minimizing anxiety, depression, even alcoholism if different motives are met and if they're met in a more holistic way that the Eastern cultures approach it from. I think there are two more. Yeah. How can we get those entheogenic outcomes without the exogenous substance? That could be meaning making. And we can strengthen feelings of interconnectivity from the self, feeling connected to yourself at a baseline, to feeling connected to the global or even universal community, sense of oneness, and encourage harmony. Oh, it says the slides are not showing.
Hmm, I'm seeing them.
Yeah, so did I.
Okay. I'm sorry they're not showing. But essentially, yeah, that was how can we do that? How can we get those practices out there? Sorry, I know that you started to move forward, but one of the mechanisms, for instance, was meditation and possibly yoga in that big table. So how can we really get to that entheogenic outcome without using that exogenous substance? How can we activate different mechanisms? That's all. That was my spiel. Thank you.
Okay, now before I turn it over to Sophia, I'll just say, reminding us of the general design, we're going to use surveys, experimental schedules, and psychophysiological outcome measures to answer 4 questions. One is what auditory elements might lead to entrainment and then raise consciousness in the terms like Richard Davidson looks at with meditation signatures. But since we don't have neuroscience right now, how and to what degree do these practices give rise to the same signatures and subjectively assessed outcomes of entheogenic experiences? And what other consequences do they have? Um, and finally, what features of individual practitioners predict differential benefits with one versus another? If I don't believe that self-actualization exists and that parenting is the top, does that mean that I really need to do some drumming and that'll help me? That's the kind of thing. Okay, so now we're going to move on to practices. Sophia, you're up.
All right. So I'll really be focusing on yoga and doing a little lit review on yoga. But before I get into that, kind just wanted to introduce yoga a bit more. So as Vaughn mentioned previously, it is a yoking of the non-transcendent. And while these are physical movement practices, they do have a more ritualized aspect to it or spiritual aspect. What practice play or which components are most prominent kind of depends on the yoga practice you are doing as well as where. So in the West, we focus a little bit more on physical practice. So practices such as vinyasa and hatha are a lot more popular. That being said, there are yoga practices such as Kundalini, Yoga Nidra, etc., that focus a little bit more on the spiritual. That being said, they all tend to incorporate physical practice, meditative practice, and they are based off of spiritual teachings, but whether that's an emphasized component or not varies. As mentioned before, they are entheogenic practices, and we kind of discussed a little bit of the history, but they've been around for a very, very long time, and they're based off of the Indian philosophy. And while there is a lot of research around yoga, as a side note, there's not really anything looking at the music chosen for different yoga practices. Similarly to Vaughn, the music, in my experience, plays a big difference in what I gain from it. So certain practices or certain instructors I find play music that really emphasizes and helps me get the most out of the practice. Other ones feels like it doesn't do anything. But again, no research really there. But I'll be talking a little bit more about lit reviews, looking at the benefits of yoga, as well as trying to tease apart yoga as a physical practice compared to yoga as a physical and ritual or spiritual practice. Before I move into that, I just want to introduce a couple types of yoga since I will be mentioning a couple specific types. So the ones that are really common in the West are Vinyasa and Hatha. These ones have big physical components. Vinyasa is more of the yoga flow that you would typically hear of. So you're not usually holding poses for a long time. It's usually just a couple breaths. And then you flow into the next pose. And as you're flowing, you're guided by the breath. Hatha is more so you're holding poses for longer periods of time and you're meditating and breathing. That breathing is guiding the meditation as you're in the pose. So bigger emphasis on a physical component, but in different ways. Yin yoga is more of a restorative, regenerative form of yoga. So it's very calming. Usually you're holding poses for a long time. However, you are typically using props to hold you up. So it's less muscle building. You're more on the ground using props to help you sink into the poses. You'll find that out here, it's typically offered at night because it is very calming, whereas Hatha and Vinyasa are offered more frequently throughout the day. And then Yoga Nidra is more of a meditative sleep, so to speak. So it's a guided meditation. There is a pose, but it's not a big emphasis on the physical aspect whatsoever. And the instructor guides you through a very deep meditation where you are on the cusp of falling asleep, but you do not fall asleep. Okay, next slide.
Before you move on, I want to make two comments. One, I just thought of a research design as you were talking, in which the music could be looked at in a way that really controls all of the other elements. So Sophia wants to run studies that look at solo versus group practice. And there, you'd certainly want to make sure that the actual practice was the same, right? So you videotape an instructor leading a practice. That's either at the front of a class with a bunch of people doing it, or it's in front of one person doing it solo in their room. And with that kind of design, we could give one group a set of music that's like really cool Indian sounding music, the stuff that we find gets us in the mood. And then the other folks are listening to Quiet Riot and Katrina and the Waves and stuff like that. That could be a funny but kind of like powerful demonstration of the effectiveness of these things. What do you all think about the control aspect of that? The experimental control, having like a video of the same actual practice with just these contextual elements differing.
I guess I'm wondering, like, I don't know if it's going to matter that much. Like your variables might not affect things that much, but that's just my intuition.
Yeah,
I like it. And I think that you might find a strange, cool effect where if you get too far into the Quiet Riot side, you might find something that works, like something that's very noisy, like oh man, I can't think of it. You'll know this band. It's an industrial band, Vaughn. Like they're harder than Nine Inch Nails. I can't. KMFDM.
Oh
Uh,
yeah. Yeah.
so like if you put on KMFDM, you might be back into something that actually works for yoga,
That's
just because it's so
super
noisy.
because another question that we've had very occasionally, it's come up. It came up in the early days of Samba, is what's up with people that are into metal? And I think there is a trance-inducing thing with that, but it's a very particular type of person that benefits from it. Um, the only other comment I wanted to make is I just heard something really beautiful recently from someone that you often hear people say that, oh, all of these yoga postures that we do were really invented in the last 100 years. That there's no evidence of them, or there's no like written documents of them before that. And this person was saying that's not true at all. There's lots of evidence that these were being used, but nobody in India practicing this thought that they should write a book about it with illustrations. It's just like a Western idea that that's how you propagate this. It was all propagated with these personal experiences. And so if you go to Kundalini, that was one of the reasons why it was so critical to have a lineage and be learning from someone, because it's not so much they were keeping these practices secret, though sometimes they did. It's that no one thought that you could learn this from a book. You had to sit there and show people, step on your fingers and stick your tongue out and turn your head left to right at this pace and say these words. So there's like a super deep tradition here, and one would imagine that even without explicit experimental methods, just like with cooking or tool design, you're going to discover things that work for most bodies in a systematic way over time. And so there could be some really beautiful insights that could be extracted from a more rigorous exploration of these practices. Okay, now I'll continue. Thank you for letting me.
Okay, so I'll start with some studies that have looked at cognitive benefits of yoga practice. Beginning first with potential neurophysiological mechanisms. So one review study found that it seems that there are two mechanisms by which benefits of yoga sort of work. One is the short term, one is the long term. Short term, it seems to work, through stress regulation. So by equipping people to better regulate their stress, they experience less stress, and so that seems to lead to some short-term cognitive benefits of yoga. As for long-term cognitive benefits of yoga, they talk about a neurocognitive resource efficiency. So this is a kind of broad, but across the studies that they reviewed, they talked about how this could mean selectively disengaging from task irrelevant stimuli, creating more resilient resting state and task functional networks, as well as protecting against age-related structural decline. So kind of broad, but that was what they identified as the long-term mechanism of the cognitive benefits of yoga.
Are these benefits sort of unique to yoga? What I'm driving at is what would be the case with Tai Chi or aerobic exercise or some other type of movement activity? Has yoga been compared with those sorts of things?
I think I'll be able to touch on that in a couple slides, but basically, to summarize, it hasn't been compared a lot. There are some studies that try to compare these, but it's a little unclear, and some of them are kind of messy. So, yeah, that's the best I can give for that.
Thanks.
Yeah. Another review paper looked at randomized controlled trials as well as acute studies to see, well, what are the benefits of yoga in these specific scenarios? And so they looked at a lot of different things. And again, it was a review, so different studies were measuring benefits in different ways, et cetera. But overall, it seems like in these randomized controlled trials, there was a moderate effect of yoga, which seemed to have its strongest effect on attention and processing speeds. Whereas in the acute studies, there seemed to be a strong effect of yoga that was specifically strongest for memory. And this is various different types of memory. So that's just across the board. As for older adults and the elderly, several different studies have tried to look at, well, can yoga help with age-related cognitive decline? And basically, they found that with regular yoga practice, it helps increase gross memory, mental set shifting and flexibility, as well as attention information processing. And specifically in the elderly, better and immediate delayed recall. Again, specifically in verbal and visual memory, but it was across the board as well. Attention and working memory, verbal fluency, executive functioning, and processing speeds. So overall, yoga seems to have the most consistent benefit on various different types of memory, as well as attention and processing speeds. Next slide.
That was a great summary, by the way, Sophia.
Thank you.
I'm so glad we'll be able to just extract the audio from this and you don't have to write that. But if we don't succeed, then write up what you just said. It was good.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, I had one quick question.
Yes.
So I was wondering for all of the benefits you listed, regarding yoga, was there a certain threshold of like how often the participants needed to do yoga practice? Do you think that would differ, like, doing yoga once a week versus making it a daily thing?
Good question. Off the top of my head, it varied a lot since some of these were review studies. In the randomized clinical or controlled trials, it tended to be at least a couple weeks. Sometimes it was up to, I think the longest was like 6 months, but I think it was normally like meeting once a week for that long. Acute studies were typically once or twice they were in a yoga class. So it seems like you could be practicing it very regularly, or you could just be doing it every once in a while and there'll still be benefits, but where exactly it benefits you does vary a little bit, but again, it's not totally clear just because studies varied a lot in how they were conducted. So that's not a great answer, but.
All right. Well, thank you.
Mhm. Another area that yoga has been looked at a lot is specifically in stress and mental health, specifically around depression and anxiety. I'm focusing on really two studies that try to tease apart the physical component versus the physical and spiritual component. So that's why there's only these two on the board. But one such study found, let me preface this by the setup. They had three conditions. One was a control group where they did no intervention. The other condition was yoga, emphasizing the physical component of it. So not really trying to touch on the meditative spiritual ritual aspect of it, really just the physical aspect. And then the third group was a more integrated approach. So this is the physical practice, the meditative aspect to it, breath work, as well as the spiritual teachings that underlie yoga practice. And they found that both the yoga groups experienced decreased depression and stress scores, as well as increased hopefulness scores. So yoga in general is useful and good for mental health. That being said, only the group that had the fuller yoga experience experienced decreased anxiety and salivary cortisol. So there does seem to be a benefit of having a fuller yoga practice. That being said, yoga in general, even if you're really just focusing on the physical component, is good for decreasing stress and generally mental health. Another study tried to compare two different types of yoga, one that they termed as a more meditative practice versus one that's more of a physical. There's some debate about that. But they found that stress and salivary cortisol was also decreased significantly more in the more meditative group, which for them was hatha yoga, compared to what they thought was a less meditative group, which is vinyasa. I do want to jump in and say that vinyasa does not only focus on the physical practice. That's how they defined it. There are versions of vinyasa, power yoga is an example, which can really emphasize the physical aspect, but it doesn't totally negate the ritual spiritual aspects. And when people come to a yoga class, they do typically know in the back of their minds that it comes from or is based on spiritual teachings. So whether they believe that or not, that history is typically present in people's heads. That being said, these two studies have found that yoga, again, in general, is good for your mental health and decreasing stress, but it does seem to be that if you're experiencing a more full yoga experience, it has additional benefits or enhances the benefits that the physical component presents. And that leads me into the next slide, which is trying to tease apart or find studies that try to tease apart the physical component from the more spiritual component. So again, yoga is built off of spiritual teachings. Physical component is important to it, but so is this more ritual, spiritual aspect. So getting at motives first, one study did find that there was a positive correlation between people who were looking to find a more spiritual connection They had more spiritual motives, and they were practicing yoga. I just wanted to throw that out there since the physical component is emphasized in the West. However, it does seem that people are in search of some sort of spirituality aspect, and yoga is a good way for them to try to get at both. And then based off of the studies I discussed in the previous slide, while the physical aspect is good for mental health and stress, adding in and making sure that you're still emphasizing the meditative aspect, the breath work, the spiritual teachings, along with the physical practice, does seem to have more benefits or enhance the benefits that are presented through the physical practice only. Yeah, any questions here before moving on?
If I can ask, I'm not sure what the control condition is here. I mean, if there's a difference, for example, between the purely physical and the physical plus spiritual, is it because adding the spiritual elevates it above the control and there's no difference between the control and the purely physical, or are both the physical and the physical plus spiritual elevated above what a control of no yoga would be? So what's the control here, and how are they dealing with the possibility of a placebo?
The control conditions are usually not great in these studies. So some of them compare it to no yoga whatsoever. Some of them try to compare different yoga practices to each other. And then some of them try to focus on the physical component of yoga, just the physical exercise, versus making sure that they are underlying and emphasizing the spiritual teachings, the meditation aspect to it, etc. They vary study to study, and there's not a lot of research out there. So it's really hard to identify what is a consistent control. But yeah, that is one of the issues with these studies, is the control's not clear if it's, or not consistently clear. It's either nothing, which a lot of forms of exercise are going to be better than nothing, or they are trying to use the yoga postures without the spiritual aspect, which, as I mentioned just briefly before, even though people may not know the spiritual teachings underlying the practice that they're attending, people generally know that it has a history of that. And so it's hard to really isolate the physical practice alone without people knowing that there is some sort of spiritual teaching and aspect to it, especially if the yoga practice still incorporates meditation, which most open and close with meditation.
Yeah.
So it's
I love
not
these
super clear.
questions. I love these questions, and your earlier comment about mixing things up leads to some really nice potential controls. So, the spiritual aspect. So, for example, one of my favorite teachers at Spirit of Yoga does a series of classes where they are about the chakras, and he has a set of uh, postures that you do for each of these chakras. And you could imagine that somebody who doesn't really know what's going on, you could have him give, oh, this is the heart chakra, and then he does a bunch of stuff that's root stuff. And so it wouldn't be fully, it would be single blind, but the people, it would mean that all the people are thinking it's got this spiritual component, but they're not getting the right rituals. But that opens up a totally different question, which the IRB board probably isn't going to be hip to. But I bet some yoga teachers are going to say, well, no, I would never teach that way. I'm not going to tell you you're opening your heart chakra and then open your mudra chakra, because then you're going to have demons come in, or whatever.
Right.
So it's really, there's like a whole other kind of ethical issue that comes up with it. But I love your questions about this, and that's the way that Sophia, the way you've laid this out, and Lindsay, maybe you can comment on this too. It really strikes me that you're making a beautiful case for a much more programmatic and rigorous investigation of these things.
Yeah. And also the way you just spelled it out is a beautiful control, because you've got both the people getting the correct heart postures and the incorrect heart postures, they both have the same expectations about what will happen. Whereas with some of the other types of control conditions where someone, for example, is not exercising at all or not doing anything, expectations are clearly different.
Yeah, yeah. We'll have to find an unethical yoga teacher and then hope the IRB approves it.
But also I think uh, it's both interesting to know that yoga works better or doesn't work better than some other parallel thing, but the fact that it does work, it's that's would be interesting if it works just as well, but no better than like jogging or something for um, reducing stress and stuff like that. It's still interesting.
Well, one of the things we'll propose uh, that was a recent innovation, thanks to Lindsay's comments on my proposal last weekend, is that we're going to use only people that are already exercising, that already have a decent level of fitness, so that we don't have to have like exercise controls, um, where we're like comparing aerobics to this or that. I don't know if that gets around it, but as we have these conversations, we're developing more and more ideas about how one can separate these components out.
Yeah, I guess what I was thinking is, it's interesting if some phenomena is better than the other. Like the yoga, like you could argue yoga is actually a better um, uh, activity because it combines, maybe the spiritual practice or something, but it actually works even better for these health benefits or something like that than others. Or you could conclude it works the same as them, but they both work. They're both interesting to me and maybe potentially uh, worthy of promoting. Go, Lindsay, go ahead. You got your hand up?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, this is very similar to the paradigm and the issues surrounding the kind of musical training literature in cognition of whether music training increases intellectual abilities or test scores or all sorts of other things, social emotional skills. So there's a ton of literature that has done this. Actually, we were just talking about this in class today. And it's going up against all of the very similar challenges that we're talking about right now. So I feel like maybe a good place to start would be to review some of those studies or like look at a few meta reviews and see what the main critiques of that kind of work is. And maybe that would help inform. This is the same thing. Like sometimes they'll have a control where they do nothing, and sometimes it'll be like they have a dance group and a music group, and sometimes it's like a theater group and a music group. So yeah, very similar in a lot of ways, I think.
Lindsay, you have repeatedly said that you've got too much work to do to really contribute to this project, and yet you keep making the case that you should be contributing to this project. So I sense some, there's like hidden unconscious elements here.
I can fully endorse finding a grad student who would benefit from doing some sort of literature review.
Okay, good. However it works.
Yeah.
Sophia, should I move on to the next slide?
Yes. Okay, so as for this is kind of touching on some experimental designs that have been used previously. Again, some of these studies are pretty limited. So most of the research has focused on comparing yoga to some form of therapy intervention or standard care. This is usually done with clinical populations. Cancer is a big one. Or to no intervention, which we kind of just talked about. And so in this case, it's really hard to disentangle the physical practice from the physical and the spiritual aspects. There are also, as I mentioned before, limited studies and sort of conflicting findings on the physical versus spiritual practices of yoga. Again, there's very few, and so it's really hard to disentangle the physical from the spiritual. And I specifically talked about that with those two studies on the previous slide. Another study compared different yoga practices to each other. So they weren't comparing it to just nothing. They were trying to see, well, is there one sort of yoga practice that has better positive outcomes versus others, or are they better for different things? And essentially, they found no difference between the different yoga practices on positive outcomes. So it's hard to really understand what's going on here, since one, there's so little research, but two, it's really hard to disentangle the physical from the spiritual, and so it's not totally clear what's going on with these two components. Another route that some people have taken is comparing yoga to other forms of exercise. So these would be physical only components that don't have the spiritual aspect to it. Again, there's very few studies that have looked at this, so take their findings with a grain of salt. But one such study compared yoga to ballroom dancing and then team and individual sports, specifically on body dissatisfaction. And then they also had a control that did nothing. And not surprisingly, all forms of these physical practices had positive benefits. And they left it with, there seems to be some sort of difference between one of these practices, but because our data is non-parametric, we aren't looking at that. So we don't know where that difference is. But they all had positive effects. The other main comparison people have made, again, very few studies on this, but what they have compared is yoga to aerobics. So one such study looked at yoga versus aerobics in women with depression. And another one looked at yoga versus aerobics in patients with schizophrenia. So these are very specific populations. They are not necessarily generalizable. But they did find that both had positive effects on the participants. However, there didn't seem to be a difference between yoga versus aerobics. But again, very few studies on this, and these were very specific populations. It hasn't been looked at really with the general population. Okay, next slide.
Okay, so actually, since we're almost out of time, there are two other things that I'm quite interested in, which drumming, blah blah blah, and ecstatic dance. But really, what I want to do is I want to just stop here because I wanted to get experimental designs, and there have been so many that have come up that I think we've accomplished what we wanted, and we have also Cam and Sophia, you guys did a great job of setting up kind of survey type items and theoretical perspectives we could approach this with, and then what's out there and the gap in the literature. So maybe we should open it up to questions, but of course, before we do that, I want to say one more thing, which is it occurred to me as you were talking, Sophia, that you showed that cortisol was lower for hatha or meditative hatha relative to vinyasa. Another experimental design. You could have you take people that have already done aerobics, so they've already got cardiovascular health. You take exactly the same set of postures. And in vinyasa, you run people through the sequence of postures 3 times. And in a more traditional hatha practice, you run them through it 1 time and they hold each pose for 3 times as long. That way you have exactly the same physical posture duration. But presumably, the reason that the other one is working is when you hold these postures for longer, it's more likely to induce not just the physical exercise, but this meditative state. Does that seem feasible? And Lindsay, you could sound off on this too. Is that what part of the difference in holding these yin postures or these hatha postures for longer is about?
Good D. Sounds like an empirical question.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely, I think it's just one of many options, which is exciting because there's a lot of, as we've just been saying in the past 10 minutes, a lot of options for directions to take this in. Yeah.
That's one of my thoughts too, Vaughn, is there's so many ideas you're coming up with, write a whole bunch of these down and then decide which ones are rank order them. Because I think, when you do a study, you invest a lot of time in it and you go like, oh, maybe I should have done that other thing instead of this thing. And like, I don't know what order they're in, but you can think about it and decide which variables are like the ones that are really the crux of what you think are most important and likely to work.
Yeah,
I yeah,
I think that's a great strategy.
I'd be concerned about the study you just described because in one group they're going through many more transitions. The ones holding the postures for the shorter amount of time are going through many more transitions. In essence, they're moving more through the sequence, through the process than the group that's holding the postures for the longer period. And is that additional movement going to do something to the energy flow or have some kind of effect?
Well, I mean, that's a good concern, but if we can measure cortisol with salivary assay and show that it's more reduced in one case versus the other, we at least have a practical consequence
Oh, yeah,
that we
yeah.
can say, hey, this is better for cortisol. And that would replicate the existing study in a way that's probably a lot tighter than their design.
Yeah. And you've got a great description for it because, it happens.
Oh, thank you, Tim. You're on the team too. You're handling puns.
He's picking up the titles.
Also, Vaughn, you mentioned if you do one yoga pose like 3 times compared to if you hold one pose, and technically it's all totaled the same amount of time, but one is more ritualistic. One is like flowing through and doing it in repetitive motions, and one is more stable and possibly more meditative. So I don't know if that would get at anything in particular, but that's kind of
Mhm.
what I thought, the direction I thought you were going when you said that.
Well,
Yeah.
that's a great counter example, and it's always fun to have studies where two different authors predict opposite things, because then you can put both of those in the introduction, and if either one shows up, you can say your hypothesis was confirmed, and authorship order can be determined by who got it right.
So
Uh, go ahead.
I'll be really fast. My thought was Cameron, your Kundalini table. It seems to me like something like that. Um, you don't necessarily have to do an empirical study, and it would be hard anyhow, exactly. But I mean, like with Doug Kenrick's thing, I think he didn't really do a study. He just said it fits theory and it's interesting socially, and so you might look around and see if there's even like religion and psychology or some journal that doesn't, a philosophy one or something, and just point out that it's interesting that there's this overlap, and this is a model that kind of combines those, and see, because it did look kind of cool to me, and I thought other people might find it interesting. It's a model, and that might be it's interesting showing how it ties in with these various pyramid ones, and that there's a parallel, and so that's just more of a social uh, phenomenon of showing like these models have some commonalities. That's interesting. So
Yeah,
you might look into just submitting it somewhere and seeing that this
I
stuff.
was kind of thinking if I could just work on a theory paper with you guys and see if the idea is even if people pick it up in general. And then alongside that, I was almost thinking if we want to kind of be a little more insidious about it or strategic, we can reference it as fundamental motives and the mystical experiences, kind of get individual differences of, oh, maybe someone's kind of lacking in this area or sees that as a source of stress. And then, like in a quasi experiment way, we assign them to a yoga practice. We don't have to unethically tell our yoga instructor to teach heart and then tell them it's root or something, but we simply just say, teach them these poses, don't tell them what the chakra is, and then see if we assign someone who's stuck in that immediate physiological need or security and we assign them to root versus any other yoga, do they seem to benefit from the root one in particular? Does that ease their their symptoms, and
Yeah.
likewise for any other.
That's a swell idea. But like what Mike is suggesting, I mean that is the goal, Mike, was to come up with a new paper because we did that one with the archetypes too, and we've got one on in the works with Erickson stages and tying it to life history. So it could just be a theory paper at BBS or Psych Inquiry and open up the conversation. But then to end a theory paper with empirical suggestions like what you just came up with, Cam, is a great idea.
Yeah, I think one of my first publications ever, while I was still a grad student, was the rising fastball, and that it's an illusion. And I remember I was still a grad student working on my dissertation. I thought my advisor is going to kill me if he thinks I'm doing stuff on the side. So I just sent it in as this. I mean, I got a great lit review, putting together all these different things that I went to like 10 libraries and stuff to get all the stuff. But it was a theory paper saying this could be true, and it was only a couple of pages long. And one of the reviewers said, I don't really believe this, but I guess there's no evidence to refute it here, So I guess it's okay as a theory paper, and it got accepted like incredibly fast. I've never had, it took like 3 weeks or something. Sent it in 3 weeks, they accepted it. I've never had that happen before, but there wasn't that much to argue. I think that like the reviewers just said like, "What's this?" and they kind of looked at it, and it was only a few pages long. Uh, so I don't know, I'm sure I just got really lucky in some way, but sometimes you can publish non-empirical papers if it's just a model and you're not claiming that you proved it. And sometimes when you try to throw in some empirical, and they start going like, "This is lousy," like your empirical control didn't work, but we didn't like it. So that's just a thought of mine that you might be able to or at least present at a conference and maybe somewhere to get the abstract out there or something.
We like
You're
the idea.
you saw Cameron.
Did Jake have a question before we call it to a close? Because we're already after 5.
Yeah, I have an idea of something you might want to add to the data you're collecting here, which is so cortisol is one obviously measure for depression and anxiety, but fundamental frequency variation is also pretty robust for depression. I'm not sure about anxiety. I haven't looked into that, but for depression it is. It would be really interesting to measure participants' frequency range during some speech before and after sessions, and then also before and after the duration of the entire experiment.
That's a great idea. I thought you
And
were
are you
talking.
doing any chanting with any of this, or is that not on the table?
That's not in this one, but that is in the larger project.
Okay.
And in fact, I mean, chanting is one where I would love to invite all of you on some Wednesday night to come out and do this chanting ritual because you will have the same experience I did, I'm sure, where you sit down and you're like, "What in the hell is this, Vaughn? Thanks a lot." And then, like, as it goes on, you start going, "What is happening?" And then you start thinking, what are the different elements that are critical here? Does it have to be in Sanskrit? Do we have to be sitting around a fire? Do we have to, do the various things that we're doing? And each one of those elements could be systematically added and subtracted. Um, but yeah, for sure, there seems to be everyone is talking in a different way afterwards. More, there's a slower, more measured kind of way of speaking. There seems to be more like confidence in the way that people are speaking, but not braggadociousness. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what we have you on this project for, Jake, is all those ideas. All right. Well, I think this was just great. Are there any parting thoughts
Before you close it off, Vaughn, let's give Vaughn, Cameron, and
you can you guys
Sophia a round of applause. That was really great. Thank you.
give it to them.
You helped organize it, Vaughn. You all get credit. Thank you on that. So now you can officially end the recording here, and